In this tutorial, I'm going to create a chainmail texture in Maya using the Arnold renderer. To start, I will actually model some chainmail. I'm going to start with a polytorus. Make the ring appropriately sized, and then duplicate it. Now moving it to offset a little bit, and I will use Edit, Duplicate with Transform to offset by the same amount several times. That's Shift D on the keyboard. Once I have a few copies, I will group them together and rotate them so that I can make interlocking series of rings. Now I'll duplicate that group, move it, and rotate it the opposite direction. Offset by half the width of the ring. These two I'll group together and duplicate and move so that it interlocks with the previous copy. Then Shift D or duplicate with transform. And now I have a nice set of chainmail rings. In order to render this might be an extremely complicated kind of render if I want a full suit of chainmail. And I may never actually have to get close enough to see all these rings in detail. Usually with chainmail, you're seeing it on characters and you're seeing it from far away. So you don't need to simulate an entire set of rings. Instead, I'll be rendering this and using the render as a texture. Now I'm going to start by switching to the top view. And in my render settings, I'll change the renderable camera to the top view as well. Now, a few other things I need to change. I need to make sure the image format is EXR. I need to specify merged AOVs. I'll choose a preset for width and height. I'm going to use 1K square. That gives me a width and height of 1024 pixels. Make sure you've chosen the Arnold renderer, then switch to the AOVs tab, select the Z AOV, and move that into active. That allows the renderer to also render Z depth. Now that the renderer is set up, I can take a look at the Arnold render view. In the rendering menu set, choose Arnold, open Arnold render view, and make sure the correct camera is chosen, then do a render. The render appeared black because I have no lights in the scene, and I actually got a warning at the bottom that says no light in scene. But if I look at the alpha channel, I can see that the rings are there. If I switch to the Z AOV, it looks pure white. And the reason is because currently my camera is, you can see, at a position of 1000.1 units in Y. So the values that it's getting is actually the world space distance units from the camera to whatever objects are in the scene, and it's not normalized, so the value is actually 1000. I can change the exposure in the display to verify that the Z depth is rendering properly, but that's not ideal. What I'd like to do is get my camera close enough to this object that the Z depth will give me better values. I don't have to do so much work with the images in Photoshop or other 2D programs to make them useful. Now I've set the camera's Y position to 2. If I hold Control and click and drag in that field, I can move that as a virtual slider, and I see that I'm clipping my rings if I get too close. I can even clip through the grid because the grid has a position of 0. So if I go negative, then the grid goes away. So place that as close to my objects as possible without clipping, and take another look at the Arnold render view. Now it is rendering, but it appears black again because there's nothing in the RGB channels. I'll reset my exposure to 0, and now I can see that the rings actually look pretty good. I can see the depth pretty well. Now this image has both the Z depth and the alpha in the beauty pass, and I can use both of those to create a nice texture. I'll do File, Save Multilayer EXR. In order to use multi-layer EXR files in Photoshop, I've installed the EXR-IO plugin. Now I can open the file. And I'll choose default options in the EXR-IO plugin. That imports the file, and I can see that I have two layers, an RGBA layer and a Z layer. The RGBA layer is the beauty pass, with the alpha channel applied as transparency. The Z.RGB layer is the Z depth, and with the 32-bit exposure slider chosen here, I can actually take a look at the values and make sure that they're looking good. In order to use the Z-depth image, I need to change the exposure so that it doesn't look so blown out. So I'll go Image, Adjustments, Exposure. You can see that there are a bunch of different adjustments that are grayed out. This is because these functions don't work with 32-bit images. So I'll do Exposure first and lower the exposure so that I get a better looking range of colors. Now I'm going to use the levels adjustment to focus in on the useful range of values. If I go too far into the histogram on either end, then I'll be clipping values. And I don't want to do that, so I find the closest value I can get to on both sides. Click OK. And I also want to crop this image so it's tileable. I'll find a feature I can identify easily as my top left corner. And I'll try to match that feature on the bottom right corner. So I've cropped my image. That should tile pretty well. Now I want to export these layers. And I'll do quick export as PNG just to make it easy. I've exported the Z channel. Now I want to export the beauty as just an alpha channel. So I'll fill the background. Now I know that it's black on white. I'll merge these two layers, and I want to invert the colors so that it represents opacity instead of transparency. But in order to invert, I can't use the invert function in 32-bit mode, so I need to change the mode to a lower bit depth and invert this layer. Again, I'll use export, quick export as PNG. And now I have my images saved. I can use those in Maya to create a texture. I'm going to create a simple scene that I can use to drape my chainmail, and I'll use nCloth simulation. In the effects menu set, I'll do create nCloth. And for the objects underneath, I'll do nCloth create passive collider. And I want to set some properties for this. There happens to be a preset for chainmail, so I'll just use that. But I'm using relatively small scale. The unit scale in Maya is centimeters by default. So I actually want to use the nucleus under scale attributes to change the space scale to something a little bit smaller. Now I'll hit play. And my cloth drapes pretty well. And I'll begin making shaders now. Because I'm going to be using Arnold, I want to use Arnold shaders primarily. So I'll start with AI standard surface. And I want to make a few of those for different things. One for the ground. And let's look at some presets like about clay. One for the ball. And another for the chainmail itself. We'll do brushed metal as the beginning texture. I'll apply some shaders. And some lights as well. Now with my scene lit and my fabric draped, I want to start creating the details of my texture. This shader I'll rename to make it easier to find, and I'll call this AI Standard Chainmail. Now the first thing I want to do is create transparency. There are a couple of ways to deal with transparency and translucence in materials. One is transmission, and this is for allowing materials to interact with light directly to allow light to pass through a surface. But what we're going to use is under geometry opacity. And this is more like clipping out parts of the model using a mask. So I'll create a new file texture to apply to opacity. I'll choose the image that I created for the alpha. Now initially it doesn't look like the transparency is working on this shader. What I need to do is under the viewport 2.0 options, I'll change the transparency algorithm to alpha cut, and then I should see transparency. In my case, it has some funny artifacts from trying to render shadows, so I'll turn shadows off maybe. Now I'm going to try to render this. I want to make sure that my render settings are correct. Again, EXR, render well camera is set, preset. In this case, I'll choose HD 720. And again, bring up the Arnold render view. Now I can see that the transparency is not rendering. Even though I know the transparency is there, and I can see it in the viewport, Arnold doesn't know that this object is transparent because the shape node under Arnold actually has this opaque checkbox set. And that's by default for all geometry. So if I turn that off, now the transparency should render properly. I also want to turn on my render gate or resolution gate so that I can see what will render and better compose my image. And I'm going to choose a test resolution that's lower so I don't have to spend too much time re-rendering things. This is starting to look like something. I want to go back to my shader and change a few things about it. Under geometry, opacity, I actually want to follow the link to the image, find the place 2D texture node, and increase the number of repeats. Let's just turn on IPR here. And change this to a greater number, like let's do 50 by 50. That might be a little too much to see it well, so let's make it smaller. Ten by 10, now I can see the pattern pretty clearly. Then I'll go back to my shader. And now I want to start working on making those individual links more visible. That's what I'm going to use the Z depth image for. Now I can do one of two things. I can either do bump mapping or I can do displacement mapping. Let's see what bump mapping looks like. I'll map file texture to bump, follow that link to the file node itself, and attach the Z image. I can see that the bump map is not repeating to match the transparency. So I could go to the Place 2D texture node and type in the same values, but that can get difficult to maintain a link between the two. Now, in order to link the Place 2D texture node between the bump map and the opacity map, I'll start by selecting my shader and then moving into the node editor and graphing the shader. So here's my AI standard chainmail. I can see the opacity map here and the bump map there. And they both have two Place 2D texture nodes. So I'll delete one of them and control middle click and drag the Place 2D texture node onto the other. Now I have the same Place 2D texture node driving both. And back in the perspective view, if I change one, it changes both. So let's try 5 by 5 and re-render. So now it matches up pretty well. The bump mapping doesn't look quite perfect yet. So let's take a look at the bump 2D node itself. I want to set the bump depth a little bit lower to make these rings look a little better. The values were from 0 to 1 instead of a narrower range. I don't want this to look like the bumps are way too deep. And I'll actually zoom in on this texture a little bit so I can see it better. I'm going to turn the metalness down on the base texture so I can get a better view of this. And that actually looks pretty decent. You can see if you get too close to this, the rings are all bendy. That's because they're applied to a surface that is being simulated as cloth, and it's not going to respect individual rings. But if we never get very close, then this should look okay. I also want to start to choose a better scale for these images, so I'll choose my Place 2D texture node again, and let's try 15 by 15. I can see the shadow looks a bit far from the ground, so I'll tweak my simulation just a little bit. For my rigid shape objects, I actually want to display the collision thickness. And for my cloth object as well. And that helps me visualize how this cloth will drape. And I don't want the thickness to be less than 0, obviously, then I'll get clipping, but I might just set it to 0 exactly for these rigid objects. And then I'll turn off the solver display and try playing again. Now I have a chainmail texture that, from a reasonable distance, is pretty convincing. Now let's take a look at how this would work using a displacement map instead of a bump map. I'll break the connection to the bump map, so that goes away. Now I need to find the shading group that this material is a part of and apply a displacement material. Again, this will be a file node, and I'll apply the same chain Z depth image. This time I'll select the shading group, go over to the node editor, and graph that. I can see I have a displacement shader attached to my shading group, and this has its own place 2D texture. So again, I want to delete that. Control middle click and drag to attach the same place 2D texture node to both images. And let's see how this renders. It's a little bit out of control. Now, that's because the image values are 0 to 1, and we're not scaling that appropriately. So I need to find, again, the shading group, the displacement material, or the displacement shader itself, and scale that down. And let's get in pretty close so we can see how this works. If I set this to 0, I get no displacement. If I set this to a slightly higher value, you can start to see that it's beginning to displace. And I might need to use very small values because we're talking about world space increments, and these chains are not very big. The displacement is working pretty well. And in general, displacement is a more expensive operation because it has to subdivide and do a little bit of extra work. But for a relatively simple model, that shouldn't be too much trouble. For cloth simulations, I usually also like to smooth the model after running the simulation. Adding a smooth node downstream from the simulation doesn't incur a great cost. It doesn't increase the complexity of the solution. It just smooths out the model. And I can see that some of the artifacts I was having with stretching rings have been mitigated a little bit. I'll do one final render at full resolution and see how that looks. Looking at the final, you can see that there are still some problems. You can see stretching rings. You can see the edge of the texture. There's still a space between the object and the ground due to the simulation. So there are a number of things that could be improved about this, and there are some limitations to this. In general, I wouldn't want to render this very close up. I would use this as a distance texture. But this gives you some of the concepts of how to work with opacity, how to work with Z-depth images as textures, and how to create interesting shaders. Thanks for watching.